Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Brother and sister, welcome back to Islamic Notes channel. The Vatican sky looked serene, but inside St. Peter's Basilica, the heart of one man was at war. Cardinal Aurelius Ventreska stood before the main altar, clad in purple robes that softly reflected the candlelight. His hands clenched over his chest, eyes closed, lips trembling in a nearly silent prayer. He had just led the grandest Mass in the church calendar, Easter Mass. The faithful had flocked to St. Peter's Square, and millions more watched through screens around the world. But when the cheers faded and the final bells tolled, silence settled into his soul. Not a soothing calm, but a suffocating emptiness. From a young age, Aurelius was groomed to be a guardian of faith, a servant of God on earth. He grew up in the seminary dormitories, memorized scripture, studied Latin, Greek, and classical theology. Degree after degree, all earned with reverence until he was appointed as one of the Vatican's highest priests, a position that brought him close to the Pope, but further from himself. That night, after the Mass ended and the other cardinals returned to their residences, Aurelius remained in the private chapel. He gazed at the large crucifix hanging above the small altar, then knelt. This time his prayer wasn't for the world, nor for peace, but for himself. God, if you're truly listening, why can't I feel you? Again, the question hung in the air, heavy and silent. He had whispered the same plea for years, a prayer for inner peace, for clarity, for a divine touch that felt real. But no answer ever came. Only the endless routines that bound him daily, prayers, Mass, meetings, protocol, church politics, and hollow smiles. A few days later, while walking through a hidden corridor behind the Basilica toward the library, Aurelius saw a young stranger sitting in the Vatican gardens. Unlike most tourists, the young man wore simple clothes and held a worn book in his hands. His face was clean, his eyes calm, and there was something in the way he sat, still, as if the weight of the world never touched him. Aurelius almost walked past him, but he paused when he caught the title of the book, the Quran. He turned curious. "Isn't that an Islamic text?" he asked. His voice was low but firm. The young man looked up and gave a respectful smile. "Yes, Your Eminence. This is a Latin translation of the Quran." "How can you read that here of all places?" "Because truth can be found anywhere, even in the heart of the Vatican," he replied calmly. The answer struck Aurelius like a hammer, not because of arrogance, but because of the quiet courage and conviction in the young man's voice. He was unlike any extremist or religious fanatic Aurelius had encountered. There was a gentleness and depth in his gaze. "What's your name?" Aurelius asked. "My name is Idris. I'm from Aleppo." Aurelius sat on the stone bench beside him. He didn't know why. Perhaps curiosity, perhaps the unrest that had gnawed at his soul like a ravenous crow. "What did you find in that book that you didn't find in your previous faith?" Aurelius asked. More to himself than to Idris. Idris closed the book gently. "I didn't grow up in a void, Your Eminence, but I found that Islam doesn't ask me to believe blindly, it invites me to think. It doesn't demand worship of symbols, but to know God directly." Aurelius was silent. The words cut deep. His own faith had long relied on ritual, on symbols, on structure. But did he truly know God? They talked for over an hour about the oneness of God, about Prophet Jesus in Islam, about Surah Maryam, which Idris said brought him to tears the first time he read it. Aurelius listened, not defensively, but with a heart beginning to open. This wasn't a debate. It was a conversation between two souls thirsting for truth. After Idris left, he left behind a small Latin translation of the Quran on the bench. Aurelius held it as if it were forbidden. But within his heart, a door had quietly opened, and through its crack, a sliver of light entered. That night in his quiet room, Aurelius opened the first page of the book. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. He read it slowly, letting the words seep into him like the first rain after a long drought. And for the first time in years, he felt something unfamiliar, yet beautiful. Presence. Not ritual, not position, not doctrine. Presence. Whose presence? He didn't yet know. But he knew one thing. The prayer that had gone unanswered was finally beginning to echo. Drizzle dampened the Vatican courtyard as Cardinal Aurelius Ventreska sat in his study, staring out the tall window that faced the inner gardens. Dew clung to the glass, blurring the view, as if reflecting the fog that had lately clouded his mind. Since meeting Idris weeks ago, his thoughts hadn't found rest. His nights were filled with quiet readings of the Latin Quran, now tucked neatly among Christian theological books on the highest shelf. He thought it was just a phase, but the more he read, the deeper his questions became. Who was the God he had worshipped all his life? Did he know him, or just the image passed down, never questioned? As he explored Islam, he found no hatred, but peace, and strangely, it felt familiar, too familiar. That morning, a thick envelope with no official seal lay on the carved wooden desk in his office. Aurelius eyed it with suspicion. His private secretary had no idea who delivered it. No return address, only one elegant line handwritten on the front. Cardinal Aurelius Ventreska, personal. He opened it slowly, pulling out several yellowed sheets of paper and an old worn photo of Moorish-style ruins. In the top right corner of the photo was written, Albacete, Granada, 1921. The contents of the letter shook his carefully constructed world, built upon what he once thought were absolute beliefs. It was from a Spanish independent historian named Don Emilio Calderón. In his letter, Emilio explained he had been researching old archives in Granada about victims of the Inquisition. He had found a court record from 1499 detailing the arrest and torture of a Muslim scholar named Yusuf ibn Faruk al-Andalusi, who refused to acknowledge Jesus as God. What shattered Aurelius was not just Yusuf's suffering, but the fact that the court documents listed Yusuf as an ancestor of the Ventreska bloodline. His family's original name, before forced conversion, was Ibn Faruk. After converting and changing identities, Yusuf's descendants scattered throughout parts of Italy. His hands trembled as he read the letter's final line. If you want to know who you truly are, the truth waits in Andalusia. Aurelius sat for a long time, staring at the old papers. A buried history was rising, like a ghost demanding to be acknowledged. His whole life he believed he came from a lineage of holy priests, but now he was faced with the fact that Muslim blood ran through his veins. He didn't leave his room all day. He traced family documents, opened ancestral records, matched names, and everything pointed to one undeniable truth. Yusuf was real, and he was his forefather. That night, while the Vatican slept, Aurelius returned to his private chapel. He didn't pray. He simply stared at the crucifix on the wall, eyes blank. For the first time, it offered no answer. Slowly, he took his Quran and opened it at random. His eyes fell on Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 256. There is no compulsion in religion. The right path has become distinct from the wrong. Aurelius closed his eyes. The verse spoke directly to him. His ancestor was forced to leave his faith, dragged away from what he believed, and now his descendant, himself, was being given the chance to see the truth more clearly. He couldn't deny that every time he read the Quran, a strange peace descended. It wasn't just the beauty of its language or the structure of its verses. It was the feeling deep inside, as if his soul was returning to something long lost, something Yusuf ibn Faruk once held, centuries ago, teachings in the shadow. It had been 2 weeks since Don Emilio's letter arrived, but for Aurelius, the world was no longer the same. He still performed his duties as cardinal, leading mass, attending meetings, greeting pilgrims. But now every movement carried caution. Beneath the robes and smiles, a secret grew, rooted, and that secret was beginning to spread, in the form of questions, in the form of quiet lessons. The basement room, once a dusty archive below the Vatican Library, now held a new meaning, a safe space to search for God without dogmatic oversight. Every Thursday night, 2 or 3 young seminarians came in secret. They trusted Aurelius, but more than that, they were seeking something they couldn't find in theology lectures. They weren't called students, and Aurelius never claimed to be a teacher. But they sat together on the cold stone floor, listening to Quranic verses in translation, read slowly, carefully, like people learning to recognize the voice of truth. God doesn't need intermediaries to be known, Aurelius once said, but sometimes we build walls that hide him from ourselves. One young man, Raphael, quietly raised his hand. Is this betrayal, Eminenza? Aurelius paused, then answered, betrayal happens when the heart ignores the voice of conscience, not when we search for truth. But the calm didn't last. Brother Leandro, a senior monk known for his zealotry, grew suspicious. He noticed Aurelius withdrawing, spending hours in the basement, and saw certain seminarians grow distant from the church's official teachings. Leandro was not just an observer. He was a guardian of orthodoxy, and he smelled rebellion. One night he secretly followed Raphael and found the basement door slightly ajar. He heard soft voices, recitations, and interpretations foreign to church doctrine. Leandro clenched his jaw, his eyes sharpened. Heresy, he whispered, deviation. And in his mind, there was only one way to save the church. Report Aurelius to the College of Cardinals. The next morning, Aurelius was summoned to the secret council chamber. Silence, tension. 10 large chairs formed a circle like Roman judges. In the center, one empty chair. For the accused, Aurelius's footsteps echoed as he entered. The senior cardinals stared, dissecting him with their gaze. One of them said coldly, "We hear you've led unauthorized theological meetings. We found a translation of the Quran in your office. More than that, Brother Leandro swore he heard you quoting its verses to seminarians." Aurelius stood tall. He didn't deny it. "I only want to know God, more deeply, without walls." Trial without light. The room was cold, though the morning sun streamed through the stained glass windows. The College of Cardinals had assembled. Each brought books, notes, and one common thread: suspicion. Aurelius stood alone. No lawyer, no defense, only himself, and a conviction slowly leading him toward the edge. "Eminenza Ventreska," Cardinal Massimo intoned, "we have evidence that you led religious discussions on non-Christian materials. A Quran was found in your study. Worse, Brother Leandro swears he heard you recite its verses before seminarians." Aurelius didn't respond immediately. He looked at each one, eyes he once respected, now stone walls. Then he spoke, soft but firm. "If seeking truth is a crime, then since when has the church stood on falsehood?" The room erupted. Some whispered. Others pounded the table. Cardinal Moreschi, the eldest, leaned forward. "This is not about your personal truth, Aurelius. It's about preserving the unity of faith. If a cardinal spreads foreign teachings, that's not searching, that's rebellion." Aurelius sighed. He knew this was coming, but he had carried the answer since the first night he read that verse in his chapel. "La ikraha fid din," he replied, still calm. "Are we afraid the truth outside will defeat the truth within? Or are we afraid that what we believe has only been an echo, not God's true voice?" The session lasted 2 hours, but for Aurelius, it felt like 2 centuries. At the end, a decision was announced. Cardinal Aurelius Ventreska will be temporarily relieved of all diocesan duties. Further investigation will determine his canonical status. He knew what it meant. The first step toward excommunication. Total severance from the church, from heritage, from calling, from the life he had built. Yet when he stepped out of that room, he felt lighter than ever before. That night in the basement, no seminarians came. Word of the hearing had spread. They were afraid. They distanced themselves. Aurelius sat alone, lit by an oil lamp and 2 sacred texts, Latin and Arabic. He opened to a new page. His eyes landed on Surah Al-An'am, verse 125. "Whomever Allah wills to guide, He opens their heart to Islam." He smiled softly, not a smile of triumph, but of return. The next steps would not be easy, but he knew. Truth never calls those seeking comfort. It calls those ready to die as who they truly are. way home. A few weeks after the trial, the Vatican issued no further official statements. There was no excommunication announcement, no clarification, but the silence of the institution was louder than any shout. And Aurelius understood. He was no longer acknowledged to exist. He left Rome quietly, wearing ordinary clothes. No cardinal robes, no sacred ring, no entourage. Just a small bag, a passport, and a crumpled letter from Don Emilio Calderon in his pocket. His destination, Granada, Spain. More precisely, Albaicin, the old quarter that was once the heart of Muslim civilization in Andalusia. Spring had just begun to greet the city when Aurelius arrived. Narrow cobbled streets wound between whitewashed houses. The scent of orange blossoms and black coffee mingled in the cool air. He rented a small room near the Mirador San Nicolas, a place where people usually watch the sunset with the Alhambra as a backdrop. But that wasn't what he was looking for. He was searching for traces. The following days he spent going through archives, local museums, and a small mosque tucked behind souvenir shops. He eventually met Don Emilio, an elderly historian with a thin beard and eyes that seemed to carry a silent library. They spoke for hours in a small cafe overlooking the valley. Emilio showed him more documents, manuscripts, court records, even portraits of Muslim families forced to erase their identity to survive. Yusuf ibn Farouk was the last of the clan who refused to surrender, Emilio said. He was arrested, tortured, then erased from history, but part of his blood escaped. In you. Aurelius looked at an old photo of Yusuf, a man with a dark turban and piercing eyes. Somehow he felt he recognized that gaze, not from history, but from the mirror. One morning he climbed the hill to the ruins where the madrasa founded by Yusuf once stood. Not much remained, just rubble and stones, some etched with faded calligraphy. But there in the middle of that nameless land, Aurelius took off his shoes. He stood facing the Qibla, not reciting, not memorizing, not following movements. He was just silent, and for the first time he prostrated, not because he had memorized the prayers, not because he had declared the Shahada in front of anyone, but because his heart knew he had arrived. That day, Aurelius wrote a letter and sent it to Don Emilio. I am no longer a cardinal, no longer a theologian. I'm just a man who wants to love his Lord fully. Yusuf did not die in that torture room. He lives in the rhythm of my steps today. Two sentences and a name. The sky over Granada was overcast that day. A thin fog blanketed the foot of the Alhambra hill, as if the earth wanted to pause for a moment. In a small mosque tucked away at the end of a narrow alley, Aurelius sat leaning against a white wall. In his hand was an olive wood prayer bead, which he had bought without fully knowing how to use. In front of him sat a middle-aged man, a local imam known as Sheikh Hassan. His white turban was simple, his eyes calm. He didn't ask much. He had only listened ever since Aurelius first came 3 days ago, sitting silently, reading, and crying without a sound. Are you ready? Sheikh Hassan asked gently. Aurelius nodded. I don't know much. I haven't memorized anything, but I know my heart cannot go back. The sheikh smiled. Islam is not a place for perfection. It is a place for returning. Even if you get lost on the way, that too is part of the journey. Aurelius took a deep breath. His voice was soft but steady. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wa ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah. Sheikh Hassan repeated it with him, then embraced him for a long while. There was no ceremony, no applause. Just the sound of the noon adhan beginning to echo in the distance, gently, like wind embracing the valley. That day, Aurelius didn't feel like a new person. He felt like his truest self, not a cardinal, not Ventreska, but something deeper, more honest. As he walked home, the sky began to part, releasing a light rain. Aurelius stopped at a street corner, then looked at his name written in the notebook he had carried since Rome. He took a pen and replaced the first page. Name, Yusuf ibn Farouk. He didn't force himself to become the Yusuf of the past. He simply wanted to continue the steps that once stopped, steps that had bled, been dragged, and burned into the silence of history. Now he continued them, in peace. that heals. A few weeks after saying the Shahada, Yusuf rented a small space behind an old bookstore near Plaza Nueva. There, among the aroma of black coffee, dusty books, and the chirping of sparrows outside the window, he began to write, not theology, not polemics, but notes of returning. The title on the first page of his book read, Letters to My Former Self. He didn't write to prove anything, but simply to tell a story about the long nights he spent with a cross and loneliness, about how a single verse could understand him more than all the dogmas he ever memorized, about Yusuf ibn Farouk, whose blood flowed silently for hundreds of years, waiting for one descendant to reopen a long-locked door. Each piece began with a prayer and ended with a small confession, not a confession of sin, but of not knowing much, and how that was what freed him. One of his quotes read, I used to pray to a silent God. Now I've learned to be silent, and God begins to speak. His days were simple. At dawn, he would wake and walk to the mosque. By midday, he wrote. In the afternoon, he sat on the Alhambra hill, rereading his own words, not to edit, but to understand them again. He wasn't in a rush to publish the book. He wasn't seeking readers. He just wanted to finish the long-delayed conversation between himself and himself. But the world always listens, even to the softest whisper. One night, a young man from Italy came to the mosque, saying he had read a fragment of Yusuf's writings anonymously shared on a spiritual forum. He said, I don't know where to go, but after reading those words, I want to search for what you found. Yusuf didn't say much. He just made a cup of warm tea and invited the young man to sit. Just as Sheikh Hassan once welcomed him, without pressure, without questions, only a place to be silent, together. Epilogue. In the clearest silence. On a warm summer morning, Yusuf sat on a large rock at the edge of a hill. The Alhambra stood gracefully in the distance, bathed in golden light. The air moved gently, carrying the scent of flowers and whispers of the past. Beside him lay the final manuscript of his book, wrapped in a simple brown leather cover. He didn't print many copies. He sent only one to the most unexpected place, the Vatican's private library, without an author's name, without a claim. Just the title and pages filled with the honesty that had long been hidden beneath robes, titles, and doctrines. The title was simple, Home. In a small Muslim village outside Granada, Yusuf now lived peacefully. He taught children to read, sometimes led prayer when asked, but more often he chose to be just a man in the back row, filling silent spaces, reconnecting prayers broken centuries ago. People called him Abu Yusuf. They didn't know who he used to be, and he felt no need to explain, because what mattered was not who he was, but who he chose to become. That night on a thin prayer rug, he prayed in silence, asking for nothing, complaining of nothing, just grateful, because the God he had long sought in the high skies had been waiting within his heart all along, and for the first time in his life, he felt whole,